My name is Betsy Cooper, and I am the director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub. We're an organization focused on training technologists how to do policy, and we do everything in an extremely practical way, as you'll get to see later today. I think it's very appropriate then that I'm introducing this next panel on industrial policy, one of the most practical areas that we need great ideas on today. So I'd like to introduce Jenna McLaughlin of Yahoo News, and also one of our inaugural Aspen Cyber Journalism Fellows, and she'll be introducing the panelists. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Betsy, who just walked off. I am Jenna McLaughlin, and I work for Yahoo News, and I have a really excellent panel here. To my right, I have Chris Painter, who, among many roles, is a commissioner on the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, which I needed to write down to remember.
Me too.
I imagine, and has had many different roles in the government, from state to DOJ, FBI. And next, we have Nazak Nikakhtar, who is the Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Commerce since March 2018. And at the end, we have Melissa Hathaway, who is the President of Hathaway Global Strategies, and additionally has had many roles in and out of government advising presidents on cybersecurity. And today, we're going to be talking about industrial policy, and we kind of got a preview of that issue from the earlier panel. John Demers and Lisa Monaco talked about it a little bit with the supply chain and Huawei. But really dialing back on this, I mean, the lines between national security and commerce, between technical innovation and competition, and these nitty-gritty national security issues, they're clearly becoming more and more blurred. We've seen it probably most recently with Huawei, but precursor to that, Kaspersky Lab was before that. And I really wanted you panelists to start and just talk a little bit, your elevator pitch about how we got here, how this became sort of one of the most prominent national security issues of our day, and important things to keep in mind as we have this discussion. Do you want to start, Chris?
Sure. Well, one of the things I did is work with Melissa in the White House back in 2009 when we put together something called the Cyberspace Policy Review. And after Melissa left, but this was clear before she left too, one of the great divides, and it still persists in our government, and it's not just in our government, it's different communities. The national security community and the economic community don't even have the same language to describe things, and they don't talk together as much as they should. Now it is better now than it was. But I remember having a conversation in the White House when we were, this is 2009, or early 2010, where me and another person who was on the National Security Council went and talked to folks on the National Economic Council. And we said, look, 4G, we probably lost 4G. 5G, we need to focus on. And there's things we could do. And the answer we got is, and it's emblematic of the title of the panel, is we don't do industrial policy. Now, of course, industrial policy is like a bad boogeyman word, and it means a lot more than that. You don't have to pick your champions. You can actually fund basic research and do other things which are critical. But I think that laid bare a divide where the then economic community didn't understand security or thought it was a drag on innovation. And the security community thought the economic community were crazy. They just were nuts. And again, it's gotten better since then, but these things have come together. And it came together with the Chinese theft of intellectual property, which was finally taken seriously when it was seen not just a national security issue, but an economic issue. It didn't really come together with telecommunications until relatively recently. And we need to bring those communities together. So I think one big issue was we don't have competitors in a lot of these spaces, and telecommunications is a key one. That was because I think we had a very hands-off approach. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a free market approach, but I'm saying we can fund research, we can do things that will create the environment so we can have competitors, not just in the US, but also in friendly countries around the world, so we don't end up in this space again.
Well, I agree with everything you said, and I really wanted to underscore sort of at least to start this notion of this common thing I hear about, well, there's, national security and economic security, and the reality is, and there's a lot of cases where they do need to be kept separate, but there's a lot of cases, frankly, that they need to converge. And they are converging, right? Where we are looking at least in the cyber discussion right now, the real potential to cause catastrophic economic impact, But again, sort of the elephant in the room always has been in recent times China. And the reality is that the U.S. has been engaging in trade, quote, I put air quotes around that, trade discussions with China. We have been now, we're starting them again. We have been since December. And some of those main, very important pillars of those trade discussions is to correct the predatory behavior that has been hollowing out critical industry, i.e. nexus to national security. So there is an area where they converge. We have to recognize they converge, and that there's important discussions to be had in that area. But we're looking at the Commerce Department sort of in the cyberspace about how a concerted cyber attack, earlier we were talking about how it could have access to sensitive, personally identifiable information, health information, have the ability to cause influence through soft power, advertisements, sort of political propaganda. But we're also looking at it from really the important national security aspect of it, right? Taking it down our power grid and crippling our transportation systems, impeding our ability to deploy military forces, halt communications during those times. And we are very vulnerable. The US government realizes that now. We've woken up to the threat maybe a little bit later than we should have, but we are very vulnerable, and the vulnerability comes from the fact that over the last several decades, our supply chains have become so integrated, but part of that is that they've become integrated with areas and regions where we don't think are responsible actors. And so what is the US government doing with that? What are our allies doing about it? So on May 15th, the president issued an executive order securing the ICT supply chain, which prohibited transactions that cause, quote, unacceptable risk to national security, and by, quote, foreign adversaries. Next week, the Commerce Department is going to come out with sort of its first understanding of that, and so stay tuned for that. But that, I think, is going to provide an opportunity for stakeholders to provide input based on your understanding of where our vulnerabilities are and how we need to define some of these terms in the EO. I will say that that's not unlike what our allies are doing. The EU is pursuing something very similar with member states to get their input about what sort of the national security risks are, what risks can be managed, what mitigation might look like. UK is pursuing the same route. We've been all talking behind the scenes about in terms of sharing information. Japan, certainly. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that cybersecurity is now being considered by countries, certainly our allies, as a key national security imperative. But you're also seeing at the same time that countries are implementing policies that are trade restrictive and now discriminating against trading partners as well. Data localization requirements is one, but there's a whole range of sort of discriminatory practices. Article 21 of the GATT and the General Agreement on Procurement, Article 23, allows for a national security measure to be used to kind of not adhere to the global trading system rules. That's being invoked, and we're very mindful of how that's being invoked and then making sure that we pursue whatever course of action. But the last point to that is the global community needs a framework for a mutual understanding for all these facts. If we're going to get ahead of this problem, we're going to need to get ahead of it with our allies, and really robust discussions need to be had, and they need to be had like yesterday, but hopefully now.
Melissa, did you want to conclude with a little bit of an introduction? How did we get to where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, how did we get here today is that we became critically dependent on commercial off-the-shelf software that was fielded to us with the principle of field it fast and fix it later, and we have Patch Tuesday. And Patch Tuesday was brought to us more than 10 years ago by Microsoft, and every Tuesday, once a month, which will be next Tuesday, they'll patch somewhere in the order of 90 to 100 different vulnerabilities in their software. And most of our organizations can't actually make those patches from 30, 60 to 90 days. And then at the 30-day mark, they'll get the next 90, and at the next 30 days, they'll get the next 100. And this is just one software organization, and Oracle is ranging about 400 per quarter. And if you just start to think about each of these different software vendors, I had the phrase of Patch Tuesday leads to Vulnerable Wednesday. And that's from our own software companies. So when we're talking about an industrial policy to secure our digital economy, we have to start to think about what are the critical systems and paths by which we're trying to do it. And we should start, some of the challenges are here at home. The vulnerabilities that are being exploited by ransomware and malicious software are the vulnerabilities in our software products, not the foreign products. And we're worried about the foreign products, I think, for the long term of how it can lead to a power of a state that will, in fact, inhibit a critical infrastructure service that's critical to our overall national economy. And those are the things, and that's really the basis of discussion. We have to be very clear what problem we're trying to solve, and we need to be self-reflective of the problem starts here at home, and we should start with cleaning up our own ecosystem.
Absolutely, and that kind of leads me into how I wanted to look at the first part of the panel on what actually is this threat. And we look at Huawei frequently, we see them in the headlines, we talk about telecommunications, how that goes from espionage even to potential destruction. But I'd love for each of you to just look very briefly on what are some of the other industries and technologies that we should be looking at beyond telecommunications? What are some of the other vulnerable areas that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, it really starts with the ICT industry is the core to the digital economy. It is the backbone of every single enterprise and every critical infrastructure. And so we have to critically look at what's going on in the overall ICT, information communications technology industry broadly, not just telecommunications, it's software and hardware that power everything. And so we have to really start to look at how do we bring about accountability of good engineering principles to these components. And right now, again, we've allowed the marketplace for the last 20 to 30 years deliver us with the principle of, I'm going to get it to market fast, and I'm going to fix it, and fix it, and fix it. Or maybe I'll never fix it, because that's what we're having some problems with hard-coded hardware that they just want you to replace after its lifespan of 2 to 3 years. And so I think it's not just telecommunications, although I think that is a very core industry. It's the overall information communications technology industry.
And I'd say that, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that the environment, I'm a recovering lawyer, so I think, actually you were too. So I think one of the issues is we have taken this approach that a voluntary approach is even for critical infrastructure. And there's been lots of progress made with the NIST framework, for instance, in trying to get voluntary frameworks out there, the CIS, Center for Internet Security, 20 controls, other things, where even the basic hygiene that would stop a vast majority of this is being done, but there's no real stick to do that, right? And that's because, as a country, we have looked at this and said, whether it's Democrat or Republican, it is bipartisan, don't want to regulate things on this score. There's always been this mantra that any kind of regulation, even small, will somehow hurt innovation. And I think that is not really true. I mean, I think you can have a balance, and you need to have a balance. And I do think what will happen, when you don't have any kind of real standard, you don't have a standard of care, there's no liability. The insurance markets don't really work. People talk about insurance doing a lot in this space, and it's doing some, but it doesn't work when you don't have anything to really underwrite against. So in time, I think the NIST standard, and this is not what it was intended to do, will become a de facto standard of care. There will be other things that will, of course, I said this 20 years ago too, it didn't happen, but I think we're at the state, that will start happening because we're so dependent on these technologies, we cannot allow these vulnerabilities to be there in the numbers and the severities they are. So I think that's going to be part of the thing going forward. But I agree, the communications sector and the technology sector are the backbone for energy, finance, and everything else. And so those are the key ones that I think, we risk, in some sense, we risk being competitive, but we also have to make sure they're safe.
I mean, I want to add, too, in terms of the sectors. So technology today underpins absolutely everything we do. My office covers everything in manufacturing services, financial services, and technology is the driver. And so going to the point of sort of what you raised, Chris, about sort of there is a divergence between commercial interests and then national security and economic interests. And the reality is that companies and corporations are going to kind of look into what is in their corporate interests. And as in the government, as regulators, we have to look 5, 10, 15, 20 years, et cetera, down the road and say what is in the interest of the US government and the global trading system as a whole. And how do we work with industry to make sure that we are doing everything we can to advance their competitive interests, but also not compromise things that are really, really important to our citizens, which really quickly brings me to the CFIUS point, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and our ability to sort of block transactions that pose a national security risk. It was mentioned earlier this morning, this question comes up of mitigation. What can we do? We're seeing an increased number of transactions in sort of like technology, right? Companies that have critical technologies or that have personally identifiable information, sensitive data, et cetera. And we're always in the interagency kind of grappling with this question of should we mitigate? Should we mitigate the risks of this transaction? And the questions I keep posing to interagency is, in terms of data, when it's kind of an intangible, what is a good, does mitigation actually work? Can you actually mitigate the flow of data going to the harmful actors? And if there is a really great mitigation strategy that is foolproof, what does that look like? And we're still kind of grappling with all these questions. So more questions than answer, but hopefully as we pose them, we're driving towards the answers. Absolutely, and that sort of brings me to looking at how we are addressing this threat that we've been discussing. Nazak, it's clear that the administration has taken a really strong stance to address Chinese aggression, the ban on Huawei, continuing to have those discussions. I've personally reported on how the Pentagon considered a blacklist of companies. You mentioned the CFIUS process. We have all these tools at our disposal. But I'd love you to talk briefly about sort of what levers are currently at play, what options are still available to us, what options is the administration considering employing, and are those sufficient? So let me start with, and that's a really important question. I'm glad we're addressing it, but let me quickly start with Huawei. So we were in the front lines of, on the Huawei entity listing. This isn't, the threats that we're under, it's not about a company, it's not about a corporation. Sure, you reprimand companies, it's not about a company and it's not about a country. You reprimand bad actors for national security violations, right? An entity list is one vehicle to do that. But in the broader context, you've got a country where it has itself proclaimed that there is no division between commercial interests and government interests, right? That China has clearly blurred the lines. It's publicly announced that there's a civil-military integration strategy, which I talk about quite a bit, but where the government has basically said any commercial actor can now be directed to act on behalf of the Chinese military and the Chinese government. So that is kind of a threat that we just don't have laws that are equipped to deal with that unless, for example, when you have that blur and the Chinese government has made it clear that their practice, the 2025 plan, the Belt and Road Initiative, is to hollow out U.S. industries. And when you look at sort of China's entry into the WTO from the time we normalized trade relations, in fact, our industries have been hollowed out by unfair predatory practices. I will say that the Department of Defense strategy report did call China out as being a strategic competitor, and I think that it did flag predatory was one of the words that they used about the trade practices to hollow out critical U.S. industries, and we're not the only ones in the United States. You've got Europe, you've got Australia, South America, and what somebody once called as the modern colonization of Africa. So a huge problem. We don't have, I'll kind of quickly mention the kind of tools we have to deal with these things, and then just listing the tools should resonate with everybody that our tools aren't equipped enough. Or we're not equipped enough with the right tools to deal with this, right? We've got sort of cyber threat. Okay, well, we can put a country, we can sanction a country, or we can sanction entities. We have the Commerce Department's entity list ability, denial orders. We have 301 authorities, the tariff authority for nullification of impairment of benefits if there's, for example, IP theft through cyber hacking or something like that. That's a tool we could use. We've got IEPA authorities. We've got a WTO mechanism, which will take years and years as it works through the appellate process. We can use the IEPA authority to prohibit sort of, in terms of national security, like the executive order did, prohibit inward transactions into the United States. But is that enough? And are we just playing whack-a-mole, which kind of goes to the point that we don't have good tools that are well equipped to deal with the expansive nature of the threat that we're facing nowadays? So there's a real driver for the international community to come together And I really question today, now this may change tomorrow depending on how countries feel, but is there consensus among the international community to kind of come together and find a solution if every country wants to retain for itself the ability to kind of get engaged in an offensive attack for whatever national imperative that they find is appropriate? So will that happen sooner or later? Eventually, but hopefully now, but I don't know if countries are quite there yet.
Right. And I'll ask you in a minute about the international scene because I know you know a lot about that, but I wanted to ask Melissa as well. I was reading one of your recent papers, including the chapter entitled Falling Prey to Cybercrime, and looking more specifically at U.S. industries and supporting U.S. innovation. You talk a little bit about some of the options for government to step in, and I'd love you to just outline that briefly and how you think that looks, particularly keeping in mind that the president has specifically said that he doesn't want the government to really get involved. So how could that look like if the government got involved to support innovation on this scene, to sort of look at this in more of a defensive way rather than a punitive method?
So, I mean, I think that there are a number of actions that, if we were to think maybe more strategically about what problem we were trying to solve, first, we could ask the telecommunications companies to do a lot more. We put chlorine in our water in order to kill the bugs, and we put fluoride in our water in order to, in theory, make our teeth strong. If you think of the internet providers as being the overall flow of the data, they could do a lot more as a managed security service for all of our industry to stop the pollution from hitting the endpoint. And that sits within the Federal Communications Commission, Telecommunications Act of '96, Section 707. It all exists. It's a question of whether or not we have the leadership to actually execute on that. And the telecommunications companies will fight back and say that they don't want to be held liable. And I could give you each argument, which would take another hour. Second thing is we could do is, I do think that we need to have an intervention in the innovation stream. And there's a really interesting authorities within the Department of Defense, the Defense Production Act, of how you can actually use money and dedicate it from a national security perspective to ensure that a product is available in the market. This is how we ensure that there's stealth paint and other from high demand or low density assets that we actually ensure that they're funded. And so within that, you could actually start to incubate the technologies that are going to be required for post-5G and the next generation technologies for telecom. You could also use the DPA in order to create an industrial consortium with our European allies to create an end-to-end product chain, of which we are competing against with the Chinese. And without that, you really have put the entire digital economy at risk to be run by one country's set of companies. And so somebody's going to have to take action. And then the third thing is that, when we wanted to have a diversity of our policies and actually incubate and generate a demand curve for alternative energy, solar, wind, alternative fuels, et cetera, we created a tax policy where we encouraged everything from companies to get a tax write-off for looking at those research and development initiatives to secondary businesses got a very large tax write-off for employing and using those renewables in their overall enterprise. And in fact, we paid our citizens tax credits in order to buy cars that were electric cars, et cetera. And we gave them rights to drive in a better highway than the rest of us. So if you want to actually get to a policy where you're building security and resilience in, you can actually get to a demand curve of enticement versus just regulatory practices.
Absolutely, and moving on to, again, the discussion of the international scene. Obviously, you're meeting with people around the world. I talked to you before I actually went off to Estonia and Finland and the Netherlands to talk about this issue. But how are our partners around the globe responding to this? What are their needs here?
So first, I just want to comment on something Melissa said. I agree with everything she said, and I'd say that we've done this before. We had with semiconductors, we did Symantec. But this has happened in the past, and it worked in the past, and it has limits too. it's not a binary thing. It's not picking national champions and picking among your children or funding the kind of things you talked about and doing other incentives. So we can do this, and we can do it with our partners. And I think there's a lot of receptivity that I've heard from partners around the world, particularly in Europe, who want to do this. So that's a good thing. What I think we misstepped in some ways. First, we've undertaken a campaign to try to get the rest of the world, especially on Huawei, to say, look, this is a problem. And it's not really gone as well as I think we wanted to, or the US wants it to. And part because there are cost concerns, it's cheaper, we haven't really convinced them of the security risks. I think the basic argument you made that it's not really the company, but the kind of system and the fact there's not accountability and they can demand it, I think that's all true. And I agree with that. But I think we've undercut ourselves in a couple different ways. First, I'm not sure that banning US suppliers from supplying Huawei is a good idea. I think that might hurt us more than it does them. But that's one tool we can certainly use and have. Second, though, when we, and this is a bipartisan issue, so my only criticisms are that when there were threats made to a lot of our foreign partners that if you don't do this, we will not share information with you, that was kind of heavy-handed, and I think that fell sort of flat. And to be fair, the administration has softened that tone since then, because I think that wasn't a good message. And particularly when you say you're not going to share information with the UK or Five Eyes partner, that's ludicrous, right? That's not going to happen. That's an empty threat, because we share information as the US government, not just to help the other countries, but to help us, to mitigate threats. And the third thing that I worry about is if this is a security issue, and I absolutely believe it is, you do not mitigate a security issue in a trade deal. You can't. So intellectual property theft, yes, that is a trade issue, and you can mitigate it. You can get some big deal with China on that. But if this is a core security issue, the kind of undisciplined, I'd say, messaging that's come out of the White House occasionally, which is, well, we'll wrap this up on a trade deal, that undercuts a security argument, not just at home, but with our allies, too. When they look at that, they say, well, is it a security issue or it's not? So Australia was actually well ahead of the US on looking at this issue, like about a year before we really started beating the drums on this. There's more education that needs to be done, but we also have to think of how we're going to mitigate this reality and start thinking about the future, too. And so that's why I think Melissa's proposals are very helpful to think about, look, we shouldn't surrender now, but at the same time, we really have to think about what the next generation is going to look like.
Mm-hmm. And Nazak, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, let me quickly add. So in terms of the negotiations with China, the elements of the negotiation that overlap with national security was sort of the IP issues and the hollowing out of industry. So I wanted to...
The hollowing out, I think that's a very good point that people don't focus on. I agree with that.
Right.
It's trying to solve Huawei and other things.
So yeah, so now let's go into Huawei. I think Huawei is at least two separate issues. The entity list results from their violation of sanctions laws, which historically, when you do that, you end up on the entity list, and we don't discriminate companies based on large or small dependence on them. If you violate sanctions laws, export control laws, you end up on the entity list. That was a national security action. Now, in terms of the president's EO or the interim rule banning Huawei and other Chinese telecom equipment suppliers from government procurement, which took effect on August 13th, that is a resiliency issue, ICT supply chain resiliency issue.
And I completely agree with that.
And so I just wanted to make sure that as we discuss Huawei, just really generally the public doesn't conflate those two issues. There was a national security issue with respect to the entity list, and then there's this sort of ICT resilience, safeguarding our supply chain that deals with sort of the other measures that we're taking.
So there's a challenge, though, I think that, as far as when you start to think about the Chinese have been very strategic in their deployment of the Huawei technologies, telecommunications, the subsidization of the product in the market, and their overall trade and diplomatic envoys around the world. And in fact, they've implemented the Marshall Plan on steroids around the world of actually building out other countries' infrastructures. And with that, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a Belt and Road Land, there's a Belt and Road Sea to build out ports and modernize core infrastructures, but there's also a Belt and Road Digital. And with that, we have to start to step back and say, United States of America and our allies are going to be dependent upon a foreign telecommunications infrastructure in every foreign country that we go to, and it's going to be very hard to unwind that. And our narrative doesn't really talk about what are the risks of the next generation telecommunications infrastructure, that it really is inadvertent access from your endpoint of the telephone all the way to the core, so you can intercept and or deny national command and control communications. That's a national security issue. It should be for everybody. And the military's command and control. And you can intercept and or divert the digital economy. It starts to become anything and everything to a country as you're going forward. Most of our allies and other partner countries, they don't see themselves at war with China, and they don't ever see that as being a risk. And so they're saying, well, I want this really good product. It actually is a really good product. It's based on stolen product from Motorola, from Cisco, from Nortel, and others. It's really good product. It's been brought together as a kludged product with the same vulnerabilities that were in those old products. And it's being sold at 40% less in the marketplace, and sometimes 60% less than the other products in the marketplace from Nokia or from Ericsson and or from Samsung. So yeah, of course, if I've got not a lot of money in my country and I need my overall infrastructure built out and I can get the product for 40 to 60% less, of course I'm going to do that.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to, the risks, I'm not worried about those same risks as Americans. But the Americans have to worry about the risks of their operations in every other one of those countries because now they're at risk.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've talked a lot about the government's role in this, I think, and I am wondering from each of your perspectives, how can the private sector additionally take more leadership roles here? Does it require specific encouragement? Does it require specific punishment for, like you mentioned, Vulnerability Wednesday? You know, how do we remove that from the calendar? How does private sector take a leadership role here? Whoever wants to look at that.
I can start because
Sure.
my office engages with the private sector all the time. So I really commend the Aspen Institute because I think in terms of sort of dealing with industries across the spectrum, they've done a really good job with in the cyberspace of kind of bringing industry and policymakers and academia, et cetera, together to kind of have healthy discussions. I usually tell most other industry groups that you can't stick your head in the sand and you've got to engage with us. But with that, I think we are always, in terms of the literature I read and sort of the engagements, there's always a lot of principles that like the government should do this and should do this, but it's the how, right? How do we get there? We really need industry's expertise of not just the sector and the technology, but also some expertise of sort of the tools that we have in the US government of how you would like to see this implemented. We all have the same end game in terms of national security, economic competitiveness, et cetera, but how do we use all the tools we have to make sure that we're achieving those goals, but not impeding your competitiveness? And the how is a really critical piece where the industry can bring its expertise to bear as well.
Definitely. And I know we just have a couple more minutes left, and I really wanted to touch on a question that's related, but a little bit far afield. We were discussing this prior to the panel. Clearly, just a couple of years ago, there were so many discussions within the national labs, NIH, Los Alamos, about partnering internationally, working with your colleagues around the globe. And clearly that's still important, but as these national security threats continue to pile up, the scrutiny has increased. How do we continue to protect national security, but still make sure that our international colleagues know that we're working with them, and also that our Chinese American colleagues in particular don't feel discriminated against?
Well, I think there's still a lot of collaboration on basic research, and I think once it gets beyond that, and this has happened, Australia's been the test case for a lot of this, right? Because they're dealing with China a lot of Chinese students are in the universities, and they kind of worried about where the national security line is. So, but I think we actually have to think about that. We haven't actually had that discussion. I think that's part of it. I also think, you can have collaboration among like-minded countries too, and make sure that you're going in the same direction. Like if we created some kind of consortium for the next generation of telecommunications, it's going to be among like-minded countries who then can, market, protect, and advance that. So I don't think it's a simple answer. And just one last thing on your private sector thing. The private sector is not monolithic. It's not just one private sector. And I think it's great to have a public-private partnership, although that term's been used so much over the last 30 years that personally I hate it because it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's like, what is the actual private partnership that you want? And I think Aspen's been doing some good things on this, as yesterday's meeting showed, and others. But you also have to have an operational partnership. What are you trying to achieve, and how are you going to achieve it? And that's sometimes going to be, especially for regulated industries, not just listening to what they want, but also saying what you need.
I will add that in terms of the international collaboration, despite sort of maybe some misinformation in the media and in the press, there is a lot of behind-the-scenes work, and we're not alienating our allies like people like to think we are. There is quite a bit of behind-the-scenes collaboration, and that's a lot leveraged by the relationships that we formed through sort of being in the government with our foreign partners. And so we are collaborating, we are exchanging notes. The reality is that not every country has the same vulnerabilities or the same leverage to deal with things. You've got countries in the EU that are completely sort of dependent on their telecommunication sector on Chinese equipment, technology, software, et cetera. You have some that are more resilient and less dependent. And so how do you get on the same page when you all have different equities and all have different vulnerabilities?
But beyond that, we also have to be better at sharing. One of the U.S. government efforts, which I agree with, is having collective action of countries against shared threats, right? This is building alliances, which is good. But if you're not willing to share information with those allies outside of the Five Eyes, it's going to be hard to get that kind of action. And that's one thing I think we need to address. How do you share information? I know it's being done.
We
yes,
give them,
but there are hurdles there, I think. I know we do,
yeah.
but
But I would actually say, in all fairness, maybe not all agencies.
Right.
Because
the
at the
U.S.
Commerce
government's also
Department-
not a model of the
Right. So at the Commerce Department, we've prepared, through the intelligence communities, we've shared a lot of information with our allies, so they kind of see the same threats we do. So maybe some are not there yet, but some agencies are actually doing quite a bit.
I think there's a great opportunity to actually pool the dollars, the research dollars, because all of our countries don't have that much money to just continue to spread like peanut butter. So if we were to actually start to think about this with our allies, and you were to pool the National Science Foundation monies with DARPA and IARPA and every other research and development agency that we've got in the United States, which represents a fair amount of our GDP, and you would take it with the Horizon 2020 research and development of all the European countries, and you would take it and pool it with Japanese and other of our allies, you would actually get a fair amount of research dollars to start to focus on what we think are the next generation things that are going to be the most important to invest in for our digital economy and the critical resilience of our infrastructures in our countries. But we're not doing that yet. We could, with the right leadership.
We'll have to see.
Great.
And I want to thank my panel, who I know need to get out of here, and I think that was a great discussion. And speaking of peanut butter, it's time for lunch.
All right.